Today we are reviewing everything there is to know about how to solder stained glass. In this video we will review many tools, accessories, chemicals, techniques, and of course my preferences on soldering stained glass windows. We will also demonstrate how to solder copper foil panels and show you common mistakes to watch out for when you're soldering your stained glass window. One of the most important items when it comes to soldering is of course the solder. Here we have several variations from a few manufacturers. But what is solder? It's an alloy that has a relatively low melting point that can be used to solder together stained glass windows. We'll have more in-depth demonstrations later on, and I'll share my favorite types a little later on in the video. The first one we will review is lead-free, with a 97% tin and 3% copper makeup. I normally use this solder for any sorts of gift items that will be handled using bare hands because I try to avoid contaminating anyone with lead as much as possible. Next up is the 60-40 solder. This solder is used mostly for copper foil because it has a lower melting point, giving it a bit of a more runny or self-leveling component to it, making the long runs of copper foil appear more uniform. Now we have 50-50 solder. This solder does have a higher melting point and is normally used for leaded glass. It dries a little bit faster than 60-40. Some people use the 50-50 as the initial base speed and then top with 60-40 because it will not melt as easily as the 60-40 when doing copper foil panels. This means it will not bleed through to the other side as easily. It is, in my opinion, kind of difficult to get lead poisoning from handling solder, but it's certainly not impossible, so be sure to protect yourself as much as possible. We'll talk about safety precautions a little later in the video. Now that we know what solder is and does, how do we melt it? That's where the soldering irons come in. First up is the ideal copper foiling soldering iron, the Hakko FX601. What makes this soldering iron the ideal copper foiling iron? Well, it has on-handle temperature control. This means when you are doing different tasks like soldering a copper foil run versus edge beading or soldering different solder types, it's nice to have the ability to change the temperature you're using. Now, if you have a normal iron that doesn't have locally controlled temperature control, are you doomed? No, there is another device called a rheostat that we will review shortly. Now, this iron does offer replacement tips and is an extremely easy replacement. This iron has several accessories including a soldering iron holder. This will keep your iron up off your work surface, keeping you from burning your table to the ground. Definitely a worthwhile investment. It also has convenient onboard storage for a wet sponge to wipe your soldering iron tip on for a quick clean mid-solder. There is also a soldering iron cover for travel or storage. There are several irons that do not have on-handle temperature control. These are also good options, especially if you want to do leaded glass instead of copper foil. For leaded glass, my personal favorite is the Weller 100 watt iron. It heats up fast and hot, making soldering joints much quicker and easier instead of delaying each joint waiting for the solder to melt. A second or two may not seem like very long, but when you have 400 joints to do on a single window, that can amount to an extra 10 to 15 minutes. And you know that if you're soldering, it can be fatiguing, so it's best to avoid creating extra work for yourself if possible. Now we are taking a look at a few of the rheostats. These devices vary the resistance on the circuit without interrupting the supply of power. This will control the current flowing through it, which pretty much means it will limit how hot the iron can get. You'll have to do some testing on your specific rheostat with your specific iron to determine what level works best for you. I personally recommend this if you want to do both leaded glass and copper foil but want to only have one iron. For me, the Hakko soldering iron is too small of a tip to do leaded glass work when soldering joints, so I would rather use the Weller 100 watt iron with a rheostat so I could do both copper foil and leaded glass stained glass projects. Personally, I prefer to work without the rheostat, so I just have both irons for those specific mediums. Next up is flux. Now this stuff is messy. It's a chemical cleaning agent that assists in metal joining. There are several different types meant for stained glass windows, including gel, liquid, and paste flux. There are several different brands, but I normally use a paste flux because it seems like I literally always spill any of the liquid or gel fluxes. The paste flux will become watery if it's pretty hot in your shop or if it was left in the sun, but most of the time it's a thicker substance that won't spill if tipped over. That's enough for me to use it pretty much exclusively. Flux flux does release quite a bit of fumes when you're using it, so you'll want to be sure to do a few things to keep yourself safe. We'll touch on that later on in the video. You can also use a flux remover on your project when you're done. These are normally a solvent or water-based solution that will help pick up impurities or other chemicals left behind from the initial flux application. Now, your iron will get gunked up no matter what. That's simply the nature of the beast. You can do a few things to clean it up. This is a non-abrasive coil which can be used to dip your iron into and cleans up the tip. You can purchase replacements if yours gets really gummed up. You can also clean up the soldering iron tip using a wet sponge like we talked about earlier. You'll also want to have a trusty wire brush. Extremely simple and cheap, yet so effective for so many applications. I use these to clean up lead before soldering, clean up solder after soldering, and clean up the soldering iron tip and heating element. You definitely want to have at least one of these at your disposal. Sal ammoniac can be used to tin your iron. Tinning your iron is essentially coating the iron so that it solders very easily. You can also use this tip cleaning paste. It's pretty similar. Now for the moment we have all been waiting for. It's time to actually demonstrate how to solder. Most of these demonstrations will be catered to soldering for copper foil. Before we get started, we do need to make sure that we take a moment to focus on our safety. Here you can see that I have an N95 mask, safety glasses, and a fume extractor. I'll also be wearing gloves and of course have my fan running for even more ventilation. I also like to wear an apron to protect my beautiful neon yellow shirts. Now in my case, these pieces were sitting for a while, so I want to be sure to do a quick burnishing in case any foil flared up and inspect the edges to make sure that the foil is suitable to produce a beautiful project that I'll be proud of after we put all the work into it. If you are looking for a more in-depth guide on how to copper foil stained glass, I did make a full tutorial where I went through all the tools, techniques, and everything you need to know to copper foil stained glass quickly and easily. So I'll put up a card right now on the screen. If you want to see that, you can click that and watch now. Now, here is a little trick if you have some big voids between your glass and you don't want to necessarily recut them. You can put some little tin wire pieces into the void to act as a reinforcement. Make sure your panel is secure because any movement will cause them to possibly roll underneath the glass and potentially cause a bit of a problem. Now, since these pieces were sitting for a while, I do want to go ahead and do a quick steel wool over the copper foil to make sure that this surface is nicely prepped to receive flux and eventually solder. Now, there are a few different ways that you can solder up your panels. I pretty much always cut from a pattern and solder up with some forms. However, every so often I will do an abstract design or something a little more casual where the size doesn't need to be exact. If you are using a pattern, you're going to want to use wooden forms to make sure that your stained glass window is going to fit in size the size you are intending for it to fit in. If you're soldering more of a free form, you mostly just need to make sure the perimeter is relatively secure, or at least that you are able to solder up the joints and thus giving the panel a fair amount of structural integrity so it won't be separating on you as you solder it. Before you start soldering, it's a good idea to keep your iron from having too much buildup of impurities on the tip and the heating element. I normally like to grab my trusty wire brush and give the iron a few passes to remove any debris as it's heating up. You can see those crusties pretty much disappear. I also like to tin up the iron using sal ammoniac. Be sure to get your fume extractor going because you do not want to breathe this stuff in. Here is a quick demonstration to clean off the tip using the damp sponge. This is what a tinned soldering iron tip looks like. Here are a few of the fluxes that we displayed earlier. One is a paste and one is liquid. Both fluxes need an applicator, which we usually use this little brush. This is the paste flux I mentioned before that isn't really watery, so it can't tip over and spill everywhere as easily. This is the liquid flux. I normally just fill up the cap so I'm a little bit of a less risk of spilling the larger container if I do end up using this type, but I honestly try to avoid it and prefer to use the paste flux. So when you grab some flux, you really don't need too much. I normally liberally apply it to all the areas I think I can get to in about 1 or 2 minutes. This is such a small piece that I'm pretty confident I can take care of the entire thing before needing to reapply the flux. As I am reapplying the flux, you'll see the pieces moving around. This is why it would have been much better to put some little nails or thumbtacks around the perimeter of the pieces to keep them from moving around. I start out by fluxing the joints because we'll start by tack soldering the joints, connecting all the pieces together. Before we actually start soldering, we should talk about the soldering iron grip. You normally want to hold it pretty much in a fist grip. You really never want to hold it like a paintbrush or a pencil. These irons are very hot, so you want to keep the tip especially away from your skin as much as possible. I normally keep my index finger and thumb closest to the heating element part of the handle so I can have enough control for delicate soldering. I prefer to solder directly from the roll. Adjust and spool about 6 to 12 inches and continue to feed the iron that way. I have seen some people cut a small piece of solder and feed it by hand, so if you find it a bit difficult to do so using the entire roll of solder, you can try that method. Once the iron is hot enough, the tip will start to melt the solder when coming into direct contact. It's ideal to start by tacking together the panel at each joint. This will add a ton of strength to the panel and it will even hold together if picked up. Although it's not really recommended to pick the panel up at this stage because the foil will start to come off the glass and compromise the project. Once the piece is tack soldered, you can begin soldering the runs. I'll normally reapply the flux to all the runs and then I'm ready to solder again. Normally, I'll keep the soldering iron in direct contact with the copper foil. Heating up the foil a bit allows for the solder to stick easier instead of trying to stick it to cold foil. I'll feed the solder into the tip continuously to ensure that there is enough material being dispersed onto the copper foil run to have a healthy joint as well as a visually appealing joint. What makes the joint look appealing? Well, you want it to look smooth and rounded, not flat or even having a bit of a sunken in effect where it looks like it's mostly just tracing the outline of the copper foil. This is a helpful beginner technique to where you can drop little droplets of solder along a run, then go back over the entire run. This will allow you to solder the run without having to worry about feeding the solder into the tip if you're still trying to get the hang of the whole process. Another good beginner technique is to first do an initial bead to attach all the stained glass pieces to their neighboring pieces and then coming back to do the decorative beadwork. This does take a bit more time, but it will yield good results. Make sure to keep your safety glasses on because you don't want any soldering bubbling up and catching it with your eye. This is something that's never actually happened to me. I much prefer to solder from joint to joint. I avoid stopping in the middle of a copper foil run because it will leave tons of texture behind and just not provide a great overall product. If you ever have to go back and fix an area, that's no problem. Start from a joint and end at a joint. Pulling the iron off the run and onto the glass will have the best chance of a nice smooth endpoint instead of a heavily textured one. Be careful to pick up your iron and solder at the same time, or pick up your solder slightly before the iron because you want to avoid the solder cooling down and attaching to your window, then mistakenly lifting up the entire panel. If this does happen, it's really not a big deal, just heat it up at the connection point and it will release. Here I have built up an excessive amount of solder and need to do something about that. What I normally do is try to heat up the excess solder to spread it out along the run instead of feeding additional solder into the tip. You'll see a big ball of solder rolled off by chance. If there was still too much solder collected up even after trying to smooth it out, you can pick some up with your iron, wire brush it off, then pick more up. I have seen some people tapping the iron on their stand to flick off the solder or wiping the excess solder into their wet sponge. Here you see we have some solder that has dripped through voids between the glass and this panel. It's not a big deal because we haven't done any sort of finished solder work on this side. However, even if we had, the technique to remedy this situation is the same. Flux up the run of copper foil over top the solder the run like normal, and slow down once reaching the solder that has dripped through. You'll want to heat that up and spread it out nice and even. Here's a demonstration of what happens if we do not use flux. First, we are soldering this piece of copper foil without flux. You'll see it doesn't really stick evenly and leaves a very poor finish, even after heating it up several times and running the iron back and forth. Now, if we just go over it with a little bit of flux and resolder it up, you'll see the solder just flows evenly over all the foil with little effort. That's why we need to be sure to flux everything up. Now here I am tinning the perimeter. This will be required because we are going back over this panel with an edge bead. You need to tin the faces along the perimeter on both sides so that the edge bead has a nice surface to adhere to. When tinning, I normally pick up a droplet of solder with the iron and just keep running it over the bare foil until it's not really dispensing any more solder. You'll get a feel of when you need to grab another droplet with some practice. So why do we want to do an edge bead? Well, it has a much nicer rounded appearance instead of the square shaped glass edge. Check the difference here where half of this edge is tinned and the other half is edge beaded. The other advantage is that it is much stronger. I was able to hit the tinned edge off much easier than the beaded edge. Now these textured areas can be tricky. I find that these spots normally need a bit more solder because the texture picks up the foil a little higher off the surface, and it needs to be filled or else it will look very bumpy instead of the smooth bead you're looking for. Where my hands are placed in this shot demonstrates a bit of a risky position where the solder could drip onto my fingers and burn me. Try to avoid holding the stained glass panel in place when edge beading, kind of like I am here. You can alternatively position the panel in between two pieces of wood to secure the panel in place instead of holding it with your hands. Here you can see the droplet of solder flowing downward because I didn't have the panel positioned properly for the solder to just sit in place. Now, if you made it this far in the video, I hope that you are enjoying it, and if you are, consider subscribing. We have many awesome projects coming up and many additional tutorials, so if that's something that you would be interested in, subscribe. Right here is a sharp corner that we're going to want to smooth out into the edge of the adjacent piece. Make sure the area is cooled down. Grab a drop of solder with the iron and place it onto the area you want to smooth out. Try not to overwork it because it will end up running off the edge, but just enough to have a seamless transition. Now, one last important note about the jump rings and where to solder them is that you always want to do them on a joint. You never want to do them in the middle of a copper foil run because it will pull away and end up failing, and pretty much it'll fall on the ground and break. So just be careful to always solder your jump rings on a joint, not in the middle of a run. You're going to want to probably hang your stained glass piece. For this demonstration, we'll be showing how to make a small jump ring hook so that you can hang your panel. We'll take some tin wire, create a loop, spin the two ends together and trim down to a manageable size. Flux up the joint that you want to hang your piece from, heat up the solder and submerge the ring within it. This will bond a good bit of the ring to the panel. Be sure to hold it in place while the molten solder dries. Shape your jump ring so that you can add a bit more solder to the edge beads adjacent to it. You want for this part to be as strong as possible. Solder up the sides and then it's pretty much ready to hang. Now, if you don't want to do an edge bead, you can instead use lead or zinc. I prefer zinc for straight edges because it is a more rigid metal and it will hold better. You can use lead also as it's more malleable. These will both give a more uniform appearance along the perimeter and add more strength. If you soldered up some came on the perimeters, I recommend these handy hangers. These are my favorite and really are the strongest. Similar technique to solder these, clean them with some steel wool, tin them, and submerge them into a pool of solder. Make sure to keep some pliers handy to hold onto them, as it will get very hot. Now, throughout this video you were seeing some footage from the Honeybee stained glass panel, and for that panel we made a full playlist and more of a tutorial style on how we made that copper foil stained glass panel, from the glass cutting, copper foiling, soldering, applying the patina, everything from A to Z. So if that is something that interests you, then I'll link a card up on the screen now, you can go watch that. That's pretty much it for this video. I hope you learned something about how to solder stained glass panels. Thanks for watching!